Imagine standing at your son's wedding altar, having poured $248,000 into his dream day, only for him to whisper, "You're just the ATM, Mom." What would you do? Isabella Rossi's next move will leave you stunned. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Eliza, for this chance to share. It's been a painful road, but I'm here to show how I stood up and reclaimed my life, no more being used. My name is Isabella Rossi, and at 53 years old, I thought I understood what sacrifice meant. With my chic dark brown bob perfectly styled and my hazel eyes bright with anticipation, I stood in my kitchen that crisp October morning, adjusting the pearl necklace my late husband Giovanni had given me for our 20th anniversary. Today was supposed to be the culmination of everything we dreamed of, our son Marco's wedding day. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my suburban home, illuminating the framed photos that chronicled our family's journey. There was Giovanni and me on our own wedding day, young and radiant with hope. A simple ceremony in the local Catholic church with my grandmother's vintage dress and his father's wedding ring, followed by dancing the tarantella in my parents' backyard while my aunts served homemade ravioli. There was Marco's first communion, his graduation from law school, his proud announcement of his engagement to Elena 6 months ago. Each photo represented a building block in what I believed was a fortress of love and tradition. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., not from nerves, but from pure excitement mixed with exhaustion from working double shifts at my real estate office for months to fund this day. This was my chance to honor Giovanni's memory and give Marco the wedding we'd always talked about during those quiet Sunday dinners when he was growing up. "When our boy gets married," Giovanni would say, his eyes twinkling as he watched Marco play in the backyard, "we'll give him a celebration that shows the whole world what family means." Giovanni had been gone for 5 years now, taken by a sudden heart attack that left me reeling but not broken. I'd thrown myself into my work as a real estate agent, building a successful business that allowed me to maintain the comfortable life we'd created together. Every commission, every late-night showing, every weekend spent staging homes, it all had a purpose. I was building something for Marco's future. When Marco had called me that spring evening to tell me he'd proposed to Elena, I felt Giovanni's presence so strongly I could almost smell his cologne. This was our moment, the chance to create something beautiful together, even if he could only be there in spirit. "Mom," Marco had said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of excitement and calculation I'd been hearing more often lately, "Elena and I want to do this right. We want the kind of wedding that makes a statement." I'd invited them over the next weekend, preparing Giovanni's favorite lasagna and setting the dining room table with our good china, the same set my mother had brought from Italy when she immigrated. When they arrived, Elena looked stunning as always, tall and willowy with long blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold. But there was something distant in her blue eyes, a quality I couldn't quite place. Sit, I'd said, bustling around them with the nervous energy of a mother who wanted everything to be perfect. "I have something I want to discuss with you both." Marco had that expectant look he'd worn as a child on Christmas morning. Elena simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Your father and I always dreamed of giving you the wedding of your dreams," I began, my voice catching slightly. "I know he would have wanted to be here for this, but I can honor his wishes. I want to pay for your entire wedding. Everything. No budget constraints, no compromises. This is my gift to you, to both of you, as you start your life together." The silence that followed felt electric. Marco's eyes lit up with an intensity that should have warned me, but I was too caught up in my own emotions to notice. Elena's reaction was more subtle, a slight widening of her eyes, followed by a quick glance at Marco that I now realize held a flicker of something like sympathy. "Mom, that's incredible," Marco said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Are you sure? I mean, weddings these days can be expensive." "I'm absolutely sure," I replied, squeezing back. "Giovanni left us well provided for, and my business has been thriving. This is what we saved for. This is what matters." What followed was a whirlwind of planning that should have brought us closer together, but somehow seemed to create distance instead. Every vendor meeting, every cake tasting, every venue tour became an exercise in extravagance that made me increasingly uncomfortable, but I pushed down my concerns. This was their day, their vision, their future. The venue they chose was Castello di Amore, a sprawling vineyard estate an hour north of the city that charged $15,000 just for the privilege of holding a ceremony on their grounds. The reception hall rental was another $25,000. When I saw the initial quote, my practical Italian sensibilities rebelled, but I reminded myself of Giovanni's words. Nothing is too good for our family. The guest list grew from the intimate gathering of 50 I'd envisioned to a spectacle of 250 people, many of whom I'd never met. When I suggested inviting my cousins from Philadelphia, the Torino family who had welcomed me with open arms when I'd first arrived in America as a young bride, Marco's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, we're going for a certain aesthetic here. Uncle Tony and Aunt Maria, they're wonderful people, but they don't really fit the vibe we're creating." I felt the sting of his words but swallowed my hurt. Elena, who had been quietly scrolling through her phone during this exchange, simply nodded her agreement without looking up. But I caught something in her expression, a brief tightening around her eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with Marco's dismissal of my family. The flowers alone cost more than my first car, imported Italian orchids flown in fresh the morning of the wedding, $15,000 for arrangements that would wilt within days. I'd suggested incorporating some of the traditional Italian flowers from our family garden, the roses Giovanni had planted for me, the jasmine that bloomed every spring, but Marco had dismissed them as too rustic for the aesthetic. The photographer was a celebrity wedding specialist whose day rate of $8,000 exceeded what many people made in a month. The band was a 12-piece orchestra at $12,000 that had played at the weddings of politicians and movie stars. With each decision, each vendor selection, each upgrade, I watched the total climb higher and higher. $50,000 became $100,000. $100,000 became $150,000. The cake alone, a 5-tier creation with hand-piped sugar flowers, cost $4,000. The linens were imported from France at $3,000. The lighting design required a specialist team at $6,000. By the time we'd finalized every detail, the total had reached $248,792. I remember staring at that final invoice in my real estate office late one evening, my hazel eyes burning from exhaustion and something I couldn't quite name. This was more money than Giovanni and I had spent on our first house. It was more than I'd spent on Marco's entire college education. To put this in perspective, I'd had to sell Giovanni's vintage Mustang, the car we'd restored together during our early marriage, and cash out part of my retirement savings to cover the costs. But every time doubt crept in, I heard Giovanni's voice reminding me that family was everything, that this was our chance to show Marco how much he meant to us. During one particularly difficult vendor meeting, where the florist casually mentioned that the orchid arrangements would require daily misting by a specialist team, I noticed Elena excuse herself to the bathroom. When she returned, her eyes were slightly red, though she claimed it was allergies. These small moments of discomfort from Elena began accumulating, a forced smile here, a quick subject change there. But I attributed them to wedding stress rather than recognizing them as signs of someone trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed by nature specifically for weddings. I woke before my alarm, my body humming with anticipation and nervous energy. After a light breakfast of coffee and toast, my stomach was too knotted with excitement to handle anything heavier. I began the ritual of preparing for what I believed would be one of the most important days of my life. My hair appointment was at 9 a.m. sharp. Maria, my stylist for the past 15 years, had understood exactly what I was going for. Elegant but not attention-stealing, sophisticated but warm. She worked my dark brown hair into a chic, voluminous bob that framed my face perfectly, the kind of style that photographed beautifully but wouldn't overshadow the bride. "You look radiant, Isabella," Maria said, as she put the finishing touches on my hair. "Marco is lucky to have a mother who loves him so much." If only she knew how much that love was costing me, not just financially, but emotionally. The past 6 months of wedding planning had been a masterclass in feeling simultaneously essential and invisible. I was needed for my checkbook, but excluded from the joy, required for my resources, but dismissed from the relationship. By 11 a.m., I was back home, carefully applying my makeup with the precision of someone who understood that today's photos would be treasured forever. I chose subtle earth tones that complemented my hazel eyes, wanting to look polished but natural. As I worked, I found myself thinking about Alina and wondering how she was feeling in these final hours before becoming my daughter-in-law. Alina had remained an enigma throughout the entire engagement. She was unfailingly polite when we interacted, always saying the right things, but there was a quality to her politeness that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. I'd tried numerous times to connect with her on a deeper level, inviting her to lunch, offering to share family stories, even attempting to include her in some of the Italian traditions Giovanni and I had cherished. But she always found ways to deflect or decline. When I'd suggested including the traditional Italian cookie table that my family had featured at every wedding for generations, Alina had politely declined, saying it didn't fit with their vision. When I'd offered to teach her my grandmother's recipe for wedding soup to serve at the rehearsal dinner, she'd thanked me but explained they'd already hired a catering company. Each rejection felt small in isolation, but together they created a pattern of exclusion that left me feeling like an outsider to my own son's wedding. "She's just overwhelmed with all the planning," Marco would explain whenever I expressed concern about Alina's distance. "You know how stressful this whole process can be." But I'd planned my own wedding, and while it had certainly been stressful, it had also been joyful. The stress had been about logistics and coordination, not about the fundamental question of whether I wanted to be part of the family I was marrying into. At noon, I received a text from Marco, "Getting ready with the guys, see you at the church. Love you, Mom." It was the kind of message that should have warmed my heart, but something about its brevity and timing felt perfunctory, like an item being checked off a list. I drove to Castello di Amore through countryside that looked like a painting, all golden leaves and rolling hills dotted with vineyards heavy with late-season grapes. The venue was even more spectacular than I'd remembered from our initial visit, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, a historic stone chapel, and reception grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. The parking area was already filling with luxury vehicles as early guests arrived for the 3 o'clock ceremony. I recognized some faces from Marco's law firm, others from Alina's social circle, but many were complete strangers to me. This was supposed to be a celebration of family, but I felt like an outsider at my own son's wedding. Inside the chapel, I was escorted to my seat in the front row by a young usher who couldn't have been older than 20. The space was breathtaking, soaring ceilings, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floors, and floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. Every detail was perfect, every element carefully curated to create an atmosphere of elegance and romance. But as I sat there, surrounded by the fruits of my financial investment, I felt an unexpected hollowness. This wasn't the intimate, family-centered celebration Giovanni and I had envisioned. This was a production, a performance designed to impress rather than to celebrate. The guests weren't here to witness the union of two people they loved, they were here to see a show. The string quartet began playing, and I felt my heart rate accelerate. This was it, the moment I'd been anticipating and financing for 6 months. The moment when my little boy would become a married man, when our family would officially expand to include Alina, when the foundation I'd laid with my love and my money would support the beginning of their life together. The processional began with Alina's bridesmaids, 5 young women in coordinated dusty rose gowns that cost $800 each. They moved with practiced precision down the aisle, their faces serene and camera-ready. The maid of honor followed, carrying a bouquet that was a smaller version of the elaborate arrangements flanking the altar. Then came Alina herself, and I had to admit she looked absolutely stunning. Her dress was a custom creation that had cost $18,000, layers of silk and lace that caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her veil was cathedral length, trailing behind her like something out of a fairy tale. She moved with the grace of someone who knew all eyes were on her and was comfortable with that level of attention. But as she passed my row, our eyes met briefly, and what I saw there wasn't joy or excitement or love. It was something that looked almost like apology, tinged with a sadness that seemed out of place on what should have been the happiest day of her life. At the altar, Marco waited in his custom-tailored tuxedo that had cost $3,000, looking every inch the successful young attorney he'd worked so hard to become. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his posture confident and commanding. He was handsome and accomplished and about to marry a beautiful woman in a setting that most people could only dream of. He should have been radiating happiness. Instead, there was something calculating in his expression as he watched Alina approach. It wasn't the look of a man seeing his beloved walking toward him to pledge their lives together. It was the look of someone watching a business transaction reach its conclusion. The ceremony itself was beautiful in all the ways that money could make something beautiful. The officiant spoke eloquently about love and commitment. The music was perfectly timed and expertly performed. The flowers were gorgeous, the lighting was flattering, and every moment was being captured by the expensive photographer I'd hired. But underneath all that surface perfection, I began to sense something else, an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with normal wedding day nerves. Alina's responses during the vows seemed forced, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Marco's demeanor was confident but cold, like he was performing a role rather than speaking from his heart. When the officiant announced that it was time for the lighting of the unity candle, my moment had arrived. This was the tradition Giovanni and I had specifically requested, a symbol of how our families were joining together, how the love that had created Marco was now expanding to embrace Alina. As I stood, I remembered my own wedding day, when Giovanni's mother had lit our unity candle with tears of joy streaming down her face, when the simple act had felt like a sacred blessing on our union. I rose from my seat on unsteady legs, suddenly aware that every eye in the chapel was on me. This was my moment to be part of the ceremony, to have a role beyond that of financial backer. I walked toward the altar with as much dignity as I could muster, my heels clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed space. Marco turned toward me as I approached, and for just a moment, his face softened into something that looked like genuine affection. This was my son, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep, the teenager I'd helped with homework, the young man I'd cheered on at his law school graduation. Despite everything that had felt wrong about this day, despite all the distance that had grown between us during the wedding planning, this was still my child. He stepped forward and opened his arms for a hug, and I moved into his embrace with my heart full of love and hope and the desperate desire to believe that everything was going to be all right. The scent of his expensive cologne filled my senses as his arms closed around me, and for just a moment, I felt like we were back to being mother and son instead of creditor and debtor. That's when he leaned down and whispered directly into my ear, his voice so low that no one else could possibly hear. "You're just the ATM, Mom. Thanks for the cash. Don't expect to see you after this." The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper. Standing there in my son's arms, surrounded by $248,792 worth of carefully curated beauty, I felt something inside me die so quietly that I almost didn't notice it happening. The chapel full of guests continued to exist around us. The photographer continued to capture what looked like a tender moment between mother and son, and the string quartet continued to play their elegant background music. But inside the circle of Marco's embrace, everything had gone silent. I could feel the weight of every sacrifice I'd made flooding back. The late nights I'd worked showing houses to difficult clients, the weekends I'd spent staging properties instead of relaxing, the vintage Mustang I'd sold that still smelled like Giovanni's cologne, the retirement funds I'd cashed out that were supposed to secure my future. All of it had been poured into this moment, this day, this son who had just reduced our entire relationship to a financial transaction. I pulled back from the hug with what I hoped was a natural-looking smile, my training in real estate negotiations serving me well in this moment of complete emotional devastation. Never let them see you break. Never give them the satisfaction of knowing they've wounded you. Smile, nod, and start planning your next move. "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. I kissed his cheek, inhaled the scent of his cologne one more time, and stepped back to perform my ceremonial role in lighting the unity candle. My hands were remarkably steady as I touched the flame to the wick, watching as the symbol of our supposedly united families flickered to life. The officiant said something meaningful about the joining of two lives and two families, but I heard it as if from underwater. All I could focus on was the brutal clarity of Marco's words echoing in my mind. "You're just the ATM, Mom." I returned to my seat with the same composed grace I'd used to walk to the altar, settling back into the front pew as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the space of 10 whispered words, my son had transformed from the center of my world into a stranger who had just confessed to a 6-month con game. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of hollow ritual. Marco and Alina exchanged rings that I'd paid for. His platinum band cost $2,000. Hers featured a diamond upgrade that added another $3,000 to the bill. They spoke vows they'd written themselves about love and commitment and forever, and kissed as husband and wife while the chapel erupted in applause. I clapped along with everyone else, my smile never wavering, my posture never slumping. To any observer, I was simply a proud mother watching her son get married. Inside, I was performing the kind of rapid mental calculation that had made me successful in real estate. Marco had just revealed the truth about our relationship, but he'd also revealed something else. He thought he'd won. He believed that now that the ceremony was over, now that he'd secured Alina as his wife and extracted the maximum financial benefit from my maternal love, he could simply discard me like a used checkbook. He was wrong. As the wedding party posed for formal photographs after the ceremony, I excused myself and walked to the ladies' room, needing a moment alone to process what had just happened. The bathroom was as elegant as everything else at Castello di Amore: marble countertops, gilded mirrors, fresh flowers in crystal vases. I stood there looking at my reflection, noting that my makeup was still perfect, my hair still elegantly styled, my expression still composed. But my hazel eyes told a different story. They held the look of a woman who had just discovered that everything she'd believed about her most important relationship was a lie. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Richard Davies, my attorney and old family friend. Richard had handled Giovanni's estate, helped me navigate the legal complexities of taking over his business interests, and had become someone I trusted implicitly over the years. "Richard," I said when he answered, my voice calm and professional. "I need to ask you a hypothetical question about contract law." "Of course, Isabella. What's on your mind?" "If someone accepts a substantial gift under false pretenses, specifically, if they lead the giver to believe the gift is an expression of love and family unity when they actually view it as nothing more than a financial transaction, what legal recourse might the giver have?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's a very specific hypothetical, Isabella. Are we talking about fraud, misrepresentation? We're talking about a $248,792 wedding gift given by a mother to a son who just informed her that she's just the ATM and that he doesn't expect to see her after today." Another pause, longer this time. "Jesus, Isabella, I'm sorry. That's brutal. Can I get my money back?" "Potentially, yes. If you can demonstrate that the gift was given based on fraudulent representations about the nature of your relationship, you might have grounds for a civil suit. The challenge would be proving the fraudulent intent, but if you have witnesses to his statement." "The statement was made privately. But Richard, I need to ask you something else. How quickly could you draw up papers for a lawsuit, and how quickly could you arrange to serve them?" "Depending on the circumstances, very quickly." "Why?" I looked at myself in the mirror again, noting the way my jaw had set into a line of determination that reminded me of my father. He'd been a man who believed that respect was earned, and that betrayal had consequences. Because I think my son is about to learn that ATMs have withdrawal limits. I ended the call and returned to the reception area, where cocktail hour was in full swing. The guests were mingling on the terrace overlooking the vineyard, sipping champagne that cost $60 a bottle and sampling hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most people spent on entire meals. Marco and Alina were holding court near the bar, accepting congratulations and posing for photos with various guests. Watching them from across the terrace, I began to see things I'd missed before. The way Marco's hand on Alina's waist looked possessive rather than loving. The way Alina's smile seemed to tighten whenever someone asked about their honeymoon plans, a $10,000 trip to Tuscany that I'd also funded. The way they interacted more like business partners than newlyweds. While I waited for Richard to arrive, I decided to take a walk around the grounds of Castello di Amore. The reception was in full swing inside, with guests dancing to music that cost more per song than most people spent on entertainment in a year. But I needed air and space to think clearly about what I was about to do. The estate was even more beautiful in the golden hour light, with manicured gardens that stretched in every direction and views of the surrounding countryside that belonged on postcards. It was the kind of place that inspired romance and dreams of happily ever after. The irony wasn't lost on me that it was also where my own dreams of family unity were dying a very public death. As I walked along a stone path lined with late-blooming roses, I heard the sound of someone crying. Following the sound around a corner, I discovered Elena sitting alone on a marble bench, still in her elaborate wedding dress, but with her veil removed and her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and I saw that her makeup was smudged from tears. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely vulnerable rather than carefully composed. "Isabella," she said, quickly wiping at her eyes. "I'm sorry, I just needed a moment." "Don't apologize," I said, settling beside her on the bench. "It's been a long day." We sat in silence for a few moments, watching the sun continue its descent toward the horizon. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "He told me you'd be gone after today, that once the wedding was over, you wouldn't be part of our lives anymore." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Did he now?" "He said you were just the bank account, and that once you'd served your purpose." She trailed off, seeming to realize what she'd just revealed. "Elena," I said gently, turning to face her fully. "How long have you known that Marco views me as nothing more than a source of funding?" She was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. "Since the engagement party. I heard him talking to one of his friends about how he'd played the devoted son angle perfectly, and how you were so desperate to honor your husband's memory that you'd pay for anything. He said you were easy to manipulate because you felt guilty about your husband dying and leaving Marco without a father figure." Each word hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm. "And you said nothing? What was I supposed to say? I barely knew you, and I was." She stopped, looking down at her hands. "You were what, Elena?" "I was trapped too," she whispered. "My family doesn't have money." When Marco proposed, he made it clear that he was offering me a lifestyle I could never achieve on my own. But he also made it clear that it came with conditions. "What kind of conditions?" Elena's composure finally cracked completely. "He has a 5-year plan. He wants to make partner at his firm, buy a house in the most expensive neighborhood in town, and establish himself as someone important. I'm supposed to be the perfect wife who hosts dinner parties and looks good at firm events and never questions his decisions. And after 5 years, he'll decide whether I'm still useful to him or whether he'd prefer to trade up to someone with more connections." I stared at this young woman who had just revealed that she'd entered into marriage as knowingly as I'd entered into financial exploitation. We were both victims of Marco's calculating ambition, both women who had allowed ourselves to be used because we'd mistaken manipulation for love. "Elena," I said carefully, "what would you do if you had a way out?" She looked at me with eyes that held a spark of hope for the first time since I'd known her. "I'd take it, but Marco made me sign a prenup that leaves me with nothing if I file for divorce. I'd have to go back to my parents' house with nothing to show for this except debt from the credit cards he convinced me to open." I pulled out my phone and showed her the text thread with Richard. "My attorney is on his way here now. I'm planning to sue Marco for the full cost of this wedding, claiming fraudulent inducement, but I have a feeling that a lawsuit isn't the only legal document Richard could prepare tonight." Elena's eyes widened as she began to understand what I was suggesting. "You mean?" "I mean that if Marco obtained your consent to marriage through fraud and misrepresentation, if he lied about his intentions and his character, then you might have grounds for an annulment rather than a divorce. And an annulment would void that prenup completely." For the first time since I'd met her, Elena smiled with genuine warmth. "You would do that for me, even though I knew what he was doing to you and didn't warn you? You were protecting yourself in an impossible situation," I said. "And besides, I have a feeling that the best revenge against Marco isn't just getting my money back. It's making sure he loses everything he thought he'd gained." We sat there for a few more minutes, two women who had been manipulated by the same man, planning our joint liberation. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. My phone buzzed with another text from Richard. "Just arrived. Where should I meet you?" I stood up and offered Elena my hand. "Are you ready to take back control of your life?" She took my hand and rose from the bench, her wedding dress rustling around her like the costume from a play she no longer wanted to perform in. "I'm ready." We walked back toward the reception hall together, both of us transformed by our conversation. I was no longer the grieving widow who had allowed her son to exploit her love and her money. Elena was no longer the trapped young woman who had married a man she didn't love for security she wasn't going to receive. We were two women with a plan. Richard was waiting in the parking area, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect in courtrooms. He'd brought his briefcase and a laptop, ready to work wherever necessary. "Isabella," he said, embracing me warmly. "I'm sorry about what brought me here, but I'm glad you called. Richard, I'd like you to meet Elena. Elena Rossi, as of about 4 hours ago, though I suspect that's about to change." Richard's eyebrows rose as he took in Elena's wedding dress and tear-stained makeup. He was too professional to ask questions, but I could see him rapidly calculating the implications of her presence. "Elena has some information that might be relevant to our lawsuit," I continued, "and she may need some legal advice of her own." We found a quiet corner of the estate's main building, away from the reception festivities, where Richard could set up his laptop and we could speak privately. Over the next hour, Elena and I told him everything. Marco's whispered confession at the altar, his long-term manipulation of my grief and love, his fraudulent approach to marriage, and his 5-year plan that treated both women in his life as disposable assets. Richard took notes with the focused intensity of a man who had spent decades building cases, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific details. When we finished, he sat back in his chair and shook his head. "This is one of the most calculating cases of emotional and financial fraud I've encountered," he said. "Isabella, you absolutely have grounds for a lawsuit. The gift was clearly given under false pretenses, and we have a witness to his admission of fraudulent intent." He turned to Elena. "And you, my dear, have grounds for annulment based on fraud in the inducement. If Marco misrepresented his intentions, his character, and the nature of the marriage you were entering into, then the marriage contract itself is invalid." "How quickly can you prepare the papers?" I asked. Richard checked his watch. "It's 8:30 now. The reception is scheduled to run until midnight, correct?" "Yes. I can have both sets of documents ready within an hour. The question is when and how you want to serve them." I thought about this for a moment, considering the options. I could wait until after the reception, serve Marco privately, and handle this whole situation with discretion. That would be the classy approach, the one that would avoid public embarrassment and family drama. But then I thought about Marco's whispered words at the altar, delivered at the moment that should have been the most sacred of our relationship. He had chosen to humiliate me in a house of God, in front of everyone who mattered to both of us, at the exact moment when I was participating in a ritual designed to honor family unity. He had made this public. I was just going to finish it publicly. "The reception includes a series of toasts," I said. "The best man, the maid of honor, and then the parents. I'm scheduled to speak at 9:45. Richard smiled with the expression of a man who had just realized he was about to witness something extraordinary. "You want to serve him during your toast? I want to serve him instead of my toast." Elena laughed for the first time since I'd met her, a sound of pure delight. "Isabella, you're brilliant." "No," I said, thinking of Giovanni and the values he'd tried to instill in our son. "I'm just done being an ATM." While Richard worked on preparing the legal documents, Elena and I retreated to the bridal suite to plan the final details of what we were now calling Operation Reality Check. The irony of using the bridal suite, a room that had been decorated with flowers I'd paid for to celebrate a marriage that was about to be annulled, wasn't lost on either of us. Elena had changed out of her wedding dress into a simple black cocktail dress she'd packed for the reception's after-party. Without the elaborate gown and formal styling, she looked younger and more vulnerable, but also more authentic than I'd ever seen her. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty about this," she said as we waited for Richard to finish the paperwork. "Marco is about to be humiliated in front of everyone he knows. Do you remember what he said about you being useful for 5 years?" I asked. "Every word. Do you remember what he said about me being just an ATM?" "Yes." "Then you remember why we're doing this. We're not humiliating Marco. We're revealing the truth about who he really is. There's a difference." At 9:15, Richard knocked on the door of the bridal suite. He'd prepared 2 sets of documents: a civil lawsuit against Marco for $248,792 in damages based on fraudulent inducement, and annulment papers for Elena based on fraud in the inducement of marriage. "The lawsuit is straightforward," he explained, handing me a thick folder. "We're claiming that Marco obtained the wedding funds through misrepresentation of his feelings and intentions toward you. His statement at the altar, witnessed by Alina, provides evidence of fraudulent intent. He turned to Alina. The annulment is more complex legally, but I believe we have strong grounds. You entered into marriage based on Marco's representations about his character, his intentions, and the nature of the relationship you'd have. His admission that he views you as a temporary asset who might be traded up in 5 years constitutes fraud in the inducement. Now, I want to be clear. While these papers reference divorce proceedings initially, we're actually pursuing annulment, which is legally stronger given the fraudulent circumstances. The annulment will void the marriage entirely as if it never happened, which also voids that prenup. What happens next? Alina asked. Once these are served, Marco will have 30 days to respond to the lawsuit. The annulment will require a court hearing, but given the circumstances and the evidence, I'm confident we can get it granted. The key is that both actions are being initiated simultaneously, which will prevent him from trying to hide assets or manipulate the situation. I checked my watch. 9:30. In 15 minutes, I was scheduled to take the microphone and deliver what everyone expected to be a heartwarming toast to my son and his new wife. We made our way back to the reception, where the party was in full swing. The band was playing jazz standards while guests danced and mingled, everyone glowing with the satisfaction of having attended a truly spectacular wedding. The head table was positioned on a small stage, with Marco and Alina seated in the center like a king and queen holding court. I watched Marco as he interacted with the guests who approached to congratulate him. He was charming and confident, playing the role of the grateful bridegroom to perfection. When people complimented the venue or the flowers or the food, he accepted their praise graciously, as if he'd personally selected and paid for every detail. At one point, I saw him lean over to whisper something to Alina, and her face went pale. She nodded and smiled, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Whatever he'd said, it hadn't been loving words between newlyweds. The best man's toast had been delivered at 9 o'clock, a rambling speech about friendship and loyalty that managed to avoid saying anything meaningful about Marco's character. The maid of honor followed at 9:20, with a tribute to Alina that focused almost entirely on her beauty and fashion sense. Now it was my turn. The band leader approached the microphone and called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a very special toast from the mother of the groom, Mrs. Isabella Rossi. The room erupted in polite applause as I stood and made my way to the microphone. I could feel every eye in the room on me, 250 people who expected to hear a mother's loving tribute to her son on his wedding day. Marco was beaming as I approached the stage, his confidence radiating from every pore. He raised his champagne glass in my direction, the picture of a devoted son acknowledging his beloved mother. If only he knew what was coming. I took the microphone with steady hands, looking out over the sea of expectant faces. These people had come here to celebrate love and family and new beginnings. They had no idea they were about to witness the exposure of a carefully constructed lie. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this very special day." Another round of applause. Marco's smile widened. When Marco first told me he was getting married, I was overjoyed. As many of you know, my husband Giovanni passed away 5 years ago, and I've looked forward to this day as a chance to honor his memory and celebrate our family's future. Murmurs of sympathy and approval rippled through the crowd. I could see people dabbing at their eyes, touched by the mention of Giovanni's death and my role as a widow supporting her son. I wanted to give Marco and Alina the wedding of their dreams, so I made them an offer. I told them I would pay for everything, the venue, the flowers, the food, the music, everything you see here tonight. It was my gift to them, my investment in their happiness and their future together. More applause. Marco was practically glowing with pride and satisfaction. The total cost of this beautiful celebration was $248,792. A few gasps and murmurs went through the crowd. Even for this affluent group, that was a substantial amount of money for a single day. Phone cameras were starting to come out, guests sensing that something significant was happening. "I considered it a gift of love," I continued, my voice beginning to take on a different tone. "A mother's investment in her son's happiness, a way to honor my late husband's memory and welcome Alina into our family." The room was completely silent now, sensing that something was shifting in my speech. But earlier today, during the ceremony, Marco clarified the true nature of our relationship for me. Marco's smile was beginning to falter. I could see confusion and the first hint of alarm in his eyes. When I hugged him at the altar during the Unity Candle ceremony, he whispered something in my ear. He said, "You're just the ATM, Mom. Thanks for the cash. Don't expect to see you after this." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that reception hall. 250 people sat frozen, trying to process what they'd just heard. Phone cameras were now openly recording, the moment too dramatic to ignore. "Now I'm a businesswoman," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I understand contracts and agreements and the importance of clear communication, so I want to thank Marco for clarifying the terms of our relationship so explicitly." Marco had gone completely pale. Elena was staring at him with an expression of shock that was perfectly performed for someone who'd known this moment was coming. You see, a gift given under false pretenses isn't really a gift at all. It's fraud. I gestured toward the back of the room, where Richard had just entered carrying his briefcase. "Marco, I'd like you to meet my attorney, Richard Davies. He has some paperwork for you." Richard walked through the reception hall with the measured pace of a man who had served papers in courtrooms for 30 years. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, guests stepping aside with the instinctive recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary and irreversible. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the soft sound of Richard's leather shoes against the hardwood floor, the rustle of papers in his briefcase, and the distant sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Richard reached the head table and opened his briefcase with the kind of theatrical precision that only comes from decades of courtroom experience. He withdrew the first set of documents and placed them directly in front of Marco. "Marco Anthony Rossi," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent reception hall, "you are hereby served with a civil lawsuit filed by Isabella Maria Rossi for the amount of $248,792, citing fraudulent inducement and misrepresentation." Marco stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. What is this?" "It's exactly what it sounds like," I said, still holding the microphone. "I'm suing you for every penny I spent on this wedding, based on your own admission that you obtained these funds through fraud." The crowd was beginning to stir now, whispers and murmurs rippling through the room as people leaned toward each other to share their shock and confusion. Camera phones were openly recording now, capturing what was clearly going to be viral content. "Mom, you can't be serious," Marco said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is my wedding day." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "The wedding day you just admitted was nothing more than an expensive transaction to you." Richard reached into his briefcase again and withdrew the second set of documents. But instead of placing them in front of Marco, he turned to Elena. "Mrs. Rossi," he said formally, "I also represent you in legal proceedings regarding your marriage to Marco Anthony Rossi." While these papers initially referenced divorce proceedings, we're actually pursuing annulment based on fraud in the inducement, which will void this marriage entirely. This was the moment that truly broke the room. If the lawsuit had been shocking, the annulment papers were absolutely stunning. Elena stood up from her chair with perfect timing, accepting the documents with the grace of a woman who had just been offered her freedom. "Thank you, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the reception hall. "Accept these papers and confirm my intention to pursue annulment of this marriage." The gasps from the crowd were audible now, people openly exclaiming their shock. Someone shouted, "Oh my God," from the back of the room. Marco shot to his feet so quickly that he knocked over his champagne glass, sending expensive Dom Perignon cascading across the white tablecloth. "Elena, what the hell are you doing?" "I'm taking back my life," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Just like your mother is taking back hers." "You can't do this," Marco shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "Elena, you're my wife. Mom, I'm your son." "You're right," I said, still speaking into the microphone so that everyone in the room could hear. "You are my son, which is why this hurts so much. But you're also a man who just told me I'm nothing more than an ATM to you, and Elena is a woman who deserves better than to be treated as a 5-year rental." "5-year rental?" someone called out from the crowd. "What does that mean?" Elena stepped forward, her black cocktail dress a stark contrast to the white wedding decorations surrounding us. "It means that Marco told me he'd decide in 5 years whether I was still useful to him or whether he'd prefer to trade up to someone with better connections." The gasps and exclamations from the crowd were audible now. People were no longer trying to maintain polite silence. They were reacting with the shock and outrage that the situation deserved. I could hear someone saying, "This is unbelievable," and another voice responding, "I'm getting all of this on video." Marco looked around the room desperately, seeing his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. These were his colleagues, his friends, his professional contacts, people whose respect and admiration he'd worked years to cultivate. In the space of 10 minutes, he'd gone from successful young attorney celebrating his marriage to exposed fraud facing public humiliation and legal consequences. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising to a near shout. "You're both insane. Mom, you offered to pay for the wedding. Elena, you said yes when I proposed. You can't just change your minds now." "We're not changing our minds," I said calmly. "We're responding to new information. Information you provided when you thought you'd already won." Richard stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention. "Mr. Rossi, I should inform you that you have 30 days to respond to the lawsuit. The annulment petition will be filed with the court tomorrow morning. I'd recommend you retain legal counsel immediately." "I am legal counsel," Marco snapped. "Then you know that representing yourself in matters this complex is generally inadvisable," Richard replied smoothly. "Particularly when your own statements constitute evidence against you." Marco turned back to Elena, desperation creeping into his voice. "Elena, please, we can work this out. We can go to counseling, we can—" "Marco," Elena interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "I heard you talking to your friend at the engagement party. I know you called me a strategic acquisition. I know you told him that marrying me was part of your 5-year plan to make partner. I've known for months that you don't love me. But I do love you." He protested, though even as he said it, the words sounded hollow and desperate rather than sincere. "No," Elena said sadly. "You love what I represent. You love having a beautiful wife to show off at firm events. You love the idea of me as an accessory to your success. But you don't love me as a person, and you certainly don't respect me as an equal partner." I watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in Elena for finding the strength to speak her truth, and sadness for the son I'd raised who had become someone I no longer recognized. The crowd was buzzing now, conversations breaking out at tables as people tried to process what they were witnessing. Some guests were already standing to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic turn the evening had taken. Others were leaning forward in their chairs, riveted by the unfolding drama. I looked around the room at all the faces staring back at me, some shocked, some sympathetic, some clearly calculating how this drama would affect their own relationships with Marco. "I want all of you to understand something," I continued, my voice carrying over the murmurs. "I don't take any joy in this moment. This is not revenge, it's justice. My son took advantage of my grief, my love, and my desire to honor my late husband's memory. He manipulated me for months, pretending to value family and tradition while planning to discard me as soon as he'd extracted maximum financial benefit from our relationship." My voice caught slightly, and I paused to compose myself. When I continued, my words were steady but weighted with genuine emotion. "Love isn't a transaction, and family isn't a business deal. Respect isn't optional, and trust isn't disposable." Marco forgot those lessons somewhere along the way, but today he's going to learn them again. I set the microphone back on its stand and looked directly at my son. "Time to pay up, Marco, but this time you're paying with consequences, not my money." As Elena and I walked toward the exit together, I could hear Marco calling after us, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. But I didn't turn around. I'd said everything I needed to say, and I'd done everything I needed to do. The $248,792 wedding was over. The real justice was just beginning. In the parking lot, guests were gathering in small groups, phones out, already sharing videos and photos on social media. I could hear fragments of conversation. "Did you see that? I can't believe he said that to his mother. This is going to be everywhere by tomorrow." Richard joined us outside, his expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sympathy. "That was either the most spectacular legal serving I've ever witnessed or the most legal spectacular serving," he said with a slight smile. "How are you feeling?" "Like I just got my life back," I replied honestly. Elena nodded in agreement. Both of us did. 3 months later, I sat in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper just as Giovanni and I used to do together. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated a scene that was both familiar and transformed, the same house, the same routine, but a fundamentally different woman performing it. Elena was at the counter making pancakes, humming softly to herself as she worked. She'd been staying in my guest room since the night of the wedding, and what had started as a temporary arrangement had evolved into something that felt increasingly permanent. We'd discovered that we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, sharing a love of old movies, Italian cooking, and the kind of honest conversation that had been missing from both our lives for too long. The legal proceedings had moved forward exactly as Richard had predicted. Marco had initially tried to fight both the lawsuit and the annulment, hiring an expensive attorney and claiming that my gift had been unconditional and that Alina's marriage had been entered into freely. But his position had crumbled quickly when Richard presented evidence of his statements and his pattern of manipulation. The annulment had been granted 6 weeks after the wedding, with the judge citing clear evidence of fraud in the inducement. Alina was free, her prenup voided, and her future entirely her own to determine. She'd found a job at a nonprofit organization that helped women transition out of difficult situations, work that she found meaningful in a way her previous corporate position had never been. The lawsuit had been more complex, but ultimately successful. Marco's own attorney had eventually advised him to settle rather than risk a trial where his character would be examined in detail in front of a jury. The final settlement amount was $195,000, not the full amount I'd spent on the wedding, but enough to make a statement and recover the majority of my financial loss. More importantly, it had established a precedent that gifts given under false pretenses could be recovered, a principle that Richard said might help other people in similar situations. The story had indeed gone viral, exactly as the guests had predicted. Videos from the wedding reception had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, with hashtags like ATM Mom and Wedding Justice trending for days. I'd received messages of support from women around the world who had experienced similar manipulation from family members, and several had used our case as inspiration to pursue their own legal remedies. Marco himself had become something of a cautionary tale in his professional circles. The story of the wedding day lawsuit had spread quickly through the legal community, and while he hadn't lost his job, his prospects for partnership had dimmed considerably. It's difficult to build a career based on trust and client relationships when your personal life has demonstrated such a profound lack of integrity. He'd made several attempts to reconcile with me in the weeks following the wedding, sending flowers, leaving voicemails, and even showing up at my house once. But his apologies had the same calculating quality as his previous manipulations, carefully crafted words designed to achieve a specific outcome rather than genuine expressions of remorse. The last communication I'd received from him was a text message 2 weeks ago. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened and I realize I made mistakes. Can we talk?" I'd shown the message to Alina, who'd read it and shaken her head. "Even his apology is about what he wants," she'd observed. "He wants to talk because it serves his purposes, not because he's genuinely sorry for what he did." She was right, of course. A real apology would have acknowledged the specific ways he'd hurt me, taken responsibility for his actions, and asked what he could do to make amends rather than simply requesting another opportunity to manipulate the situation. I hadn't responded to the text. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes, but the story wasn't entirely about loss and betrayal. In many ways, the events of that October evening had led to unexpected gifts and new beginnings. Alina had become the daughter I'd never had, bringing energy and laughter back into my house in ways I hadn't expected. She was 28 years old, intelligent and funny and kind, with dreams and ambitions that had been suppressed during her relationship with Marco, but were now flourishing in an environment of support and encouragement. We'd started a small business together, a wedding planning service that specialized in helping couples create meaningful celebrations within realistic budgets. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that we were now helping other people plan the kind of wedding that had been the backdrop for our own liberation. But we approached each client with a focus on authentic emotion rather than expensive spectacle. Our first client had been a young couple with a budget of $8,000 who wanted to get married in the bride's grandmother's backyard. We'd helped them create a celebration that was infinitely more beautiful and meaningful than Marco's $248,792 production had been, proving that love and creativity mattered more than unlimited funding. The business was growing steadily, supported by word-of-mouth referrals and a reputation for creating weddings that felt genuine rather than performative. More importantly, it gave both Alina and me a sense of purpose and partnership that we'd been missing in our previous lives. As I sat there that Sunday morning, watching Alina cook and listening to her humming, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Not the peace of resignation or acceptance, but the peace of knowing that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with exactly the right people, living exactly the life I was meant to live. My phone buzzed with a text message from Richard, sharing a photo from his own daughter's wedding the day before, a simple, joyful celebration in a local park with homemade decorations and a potluck reception. "This is what a real wedding looks like," his message read. "Thanks for reminding me what matters." I showed the photo to Alina, who smiled with genuine delight. "That's beautiful," she said. "Look how happy they look." She was right. The bride and groom in the photo were radiating the kind of joy that no amount of money could buy, the joy of two people who had chosen each other freely, without calculation or agenda, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported them. "You know what?" Alina said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "I'm grateful for everything that happened, even the painful parts. If Marco hadn't shown his true colors, I might have spent 5 years or more trapped in a marriage with someone who didn't value me, and I never would have met you." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "I'm grateful too," I said. "Giovanni always said that everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see the reason at the time. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach us what's truly priceless. And sometimes, when someone shows you who they really are, the best response isn't to try to change them, it's to thank them for the clarity and build something better without them." Marco had called me an ATM, and in a way, he'd been right. But ATMs have withdrawal limits, and once you've exceeded them, the machine stops dispensing cash and starts asking questions. I'd finally learned to ask the right questions, and for the first time in years, I loved the answers I was getting.
Isabella Rossi, thank you for your raw honesty and strength. Your story reveals that when family betrays through manipulation, challenging it can lead to unexpected bonds and self-empowerment, reminding us all that love must be genuine. I'm Eliza Quinn, and remember, here on Wedding Day, justice veils off, justice on.